Welcome to Australian Hiker, your online hiking resource. We're your hosts, Tim and Jill Savage.
This is episode 116 of the Australian Hiker podcast. And in this week's episode, we're going to be talking about choosing the right sleeping mat. Now, your sleeping mat or pad, and these terms tend to be interchangeable here, can make the difference between a bad night's sleep and a great night's sleep. But it's not as easy as just grabbing the first mat you see or the colour you happen to like. There's a large range of brands and models on the market, and choosing the right one can be confusing. So in today's episode, we're going to be talking about providing a bit of an overview to help you make the correct selection.
And I think something to consider is that when you do talk to some people, I know first off I got some great advice, which, you know, in hindsight probably wasn't that great, which was along the lines of, well, it really doesn't matter, Jill, which sleeping mat you choose. After 3 days of not sleeping, you'll sleep anywhere. And I can assure you, after 3 days of not sleeping, I will not sleep anywhere.
We're going to talk about the basics. And I suppose the first thing we're going to look at is the types of sleeping mats. And really, there are three main types of sleeping mats on the market. And these are the foam pads. And if you think yoga mat, that's probably a good indication.
Well, slightly thicker, like yoga mat.
Yeah, slightly thicker. These things have been around for quite a few years. They really are around about a centimetre and a half of just this hard compressed foam that provides a bit of protection and padding for you. The good thing with these type of mats is they're relatively cheap. They're very durable. And they will provide that protection against moisture on underneath your sleeping bag and underneath you if you're not using a bag. The problem with this type of mat is that while they are cheaper and more durable, they're not necessarily the most comfortable things in the world. And for me, being a side sleeper, where I'm lying on my side and I've got hip bones and shoulder bones digging into the ground, there's a limit to how long I can actually stay on my side before I've got to roll over.
I've got a Thermarest Z-Lite Sole, and that's one of the kinds of sleeping mats that we're talking about here. And I do find it good for short trips, so a couple of overnights. It's relatively easy to stick on the outside of your pack. It doesn't get in the way, but I wouldn't want to use it for a long distance hike.
Now, these were the mats that were the first, if you like. Apart from having blankets or bits of canvas that you used to lie on, these were the first real sleeping pads or sleeping mats available for the modern hiking industry. Now, the next type we're going to talk about is the self-inflating mats. These mats rely on having a bit of air in them, and basically you unroll them, and when you open the valve, air actually will flow into these mats by themselves, providing what amounts to a foam mat with a bit of air in them as well. I have used one of these. I mean, when they first came out, it took me a little while to go through and buy one, but it was a big step forward from the state foam type mats. They were a very expensive mat at that time. The prices have certainly dropped now because there's other things that have taken over. But they made a big difference. But again, even from a point of view of being a side sleeper, I still didn't find them as comfortable as I would like.
Yeah, and they tend to be a little bit heavier, a little bit bulkier as well. I do like the idea of them almost fully inflating by themselves. That's always nice at the end of the day when you don't have to put too much effort into inflating a mat.
And even though they are a self-inflating mat, I always used to find that when I did use them, and I will very occasionally wear them these days, I'd always used to put a couple of breaths of air in there just to get a bit of extra cushioning for me.
Yeah, it wasn't they weren't quite there if you left them to their own devices, were they?
The third and final type of mat is the inflatable mat. And if you think back to the old days, or if you're a kid of the old lilos.
Surfing with a lilo.
Yeah, and that's really what they were. They're a material mat that you put air into. And I suppose the lilos really were the first type of mat. Wonderful if you're car camping, very bulky, not the sort of thing you'd really want to take camping. But from a hiking point of view, where you're carrying it in a pack all day, the more modern mats are very high tech, much more lighter weight compared to the old lilo as that used to be around, and they are much more comfortable as well. So again, as I said, as a side sleeper, providing you're not going for the thinnest one you can find, it's actually quite comfortable to lie on the side. Your hips and your shoulders aren't digging into the ground.
And one of the things about all of the variations of the earlier mats is that there were varying degrees of comfort, but they didn't really think about insulating properties and the conditions in which you were actually, camping overnight.
Now, Jill just mentioned insulation, and certainly from a point of view of why do we actually use sleeping mats, one is, which we've just talked about in relation to comfort. If you are sleeping on dry, hard ground with no padding underneath, you're not going to get a very good night's sleep.
I was going to say, you're not sleeping, really.
or you're not going to sleep at all. But the other reason is for insulation. Now, insulation is insulation from your body to the ground. If you've ever lain on the ground, particularly when it's not the middle of summer, you'll notice that you start getting a bit cool after a while. And so if it is a colder part of the year and you're lying on a fairly cold ground, even if it might be grass, which might be nice and soft, you start getting cold quite quickly as the soil actually draws heat out of your body. So in relation to insulation and sleeping mats, when you go into a store or look on an online store, you'll see a term that's often used, which is called R-value. Now, R-value is basically a term that's used in relation to not just insulated sleeping mats, but also with housing insulation as well. For those of you in Australia, you'll go into a hardware store and buy bats that have either be R4 or R5, and that's the degree of insulation that they have on them. And this also applies to sleeping mats as well. Now, it can be a bit confusing, but the simplest way to think about the R value is the lower the number, the less insulation that's going to be provided. The higher the number, the more insulation you're actually getting out of a mat. So most sleeping mats that are on the market, in Australia at least, will have an R value associated with them. In some overseas countries, particularly the US, the R value is not as common, or the way it's applied is not as common. And in fact, in the US, you'll get a lot of manufacturers who will apply their own R value and say, we think this mat is this particular value. And it's a bit like comparing apples to oranges, that they don't always do this accurately. So in the States, over the last 12 to 18 months, they've come up with a new standard called the ASTM standard. And if you go to the written version of this podcast, we'll have links that talk about that. But what that does is it provides a testing process that mats can be tested against. So it means you are testing one mat against another mat in an equal fashion. This has become a big thing in the States in particular, with companies such as REI, which is one of the big outdoor stores in the States, making the decision that from, I think it's around about 2020 onwards, they will only stocking mats that have been tested under this standard. And that way it means that when people go through and buy these mats, they know that, okay, I've got two mats here that are both R3, and I know they're going to give me the same warmth. Now I need to look at the pricing and all the other features as well. Now, the ASTM standard, as I said, will allow consumers to do an easy comparison between different brands and different models of mats. Now, in relation to R values, it's a matter of deciding what you actually need in relation to warmth. And I was quite interested to find out that, doing a bit of research for this podcast and this written article, that the recommendation is for an R value around about the R 4.0 mark. And when I looked at this, I couldn't quite work out why. And they're basically saying that if you have a sleeping bag which will also have a particular temperature rating on it, for that temperature rating to be accurate, the sleeping mat needs to be around about that R 4.0. And unsurprisingly enough, a lot of the high quality sleeping mats that are sold in Australia will have an R value of 3.8, so it's close to being 4. So you know that your sleeping bag will actually, if it's a -2 degree sleeping bag, will actually keep you warm at -2. If you put a sleeping bag that's a -2 degree bag and your R value of your mat is 1, it's not going to keep you anywhere near as warm. So when you talk about a sleep system, if you like, it's the mat, it's the sleeping bag, it's what you're actually wearing at the same time. They're the main things equipment-wise that you've got control over.
Yeah, and I think sometimes we think about these things in isolation rather than the package of things that go together. And I think with, if this becomes a little bit more popular in Australia in terms of setting a minimum standard, which is essentially what we're saying is 3.8, that will make it easier for hikers to work out what they really need on any one particular hiking journey.
So the recommendations from the manufacturers are for a summertime, so during the hot weather, you want an R value of round about R1 to R2.1. For spring or autumn, and when we're talking about spring or autumn, we're talking about mid-spring to mid-autumn, not right at the
not the frosty,
part of those times of the year. They're talking about an R value of R2.1 to R3.3, and then for winter, R3.3 to R5. In relation to a mat with an R5, there are mats available with that rating on the market or better. But when you're talking about that sort of degree of warmth, you're probably going to be camping in snow, and that's where you're really going to need that rating. But for a typical winter where you're not dealing with snow conditions, as we mentioned, an R3.3 to that 3.8 mark is going to keep you pretty well looked after for the whole year. So, do you want a mat that's only going to do you for summertime and then you'll have another mat that does you in winter? But if you don't camp in wintertime, it may not be an issue. So these are all considerations to think of when choosing a mat. But in most cases, if you only want to buy one mat that's going to do you for most of the year and you're not going to be dealing with snow conditions, look at a mat with an R value of around about the 3.8 to 4 mark. Recently, we did a Facebook survey with our online community just to see what people were using as far as their reasons for choosing particular sleeping mats and what they were actually using. And whilst some of the responses didn't surprise me, a couple of them did. So, not understandably, when we're doing a survey on sleeping mats, most people are saying they're going to be overnight hiking. So, 48.6% of our respondents said they were hiking regularly and camping overnight, and then 50.5% were camping occasionally. And they were saying just a few percent of people. Obviously, if you're not looking at sleeping mats, you're not likely to be answering a question.
Yeah, that's right.
So, but at least this is a
bit of self-selection happening.
It is. The next sort of thing that I asked is, what type of sleeper are you mainly? And this one did surprise me. We came up with the biggest one is the side sleepers, and they were 52% of the respondents. So you're lying on your side, and this is your most common form of sleep. The next one, which is where I sit in, I'm all over the place. So changing from back to front to side throughout the night, and that was just on 39%. The next one, which really did surprise me, was 7.3% of sleepers were sleeping on their stomach. And that left around about 2% of people who were sleeping on their back. And this really did surprise me. I thought that,
In what way?
Well, I think when you think about sleeping when you're out camping, you're lying on your stomach with the sleeping bag on the top of you. It just doesn't seem something that seems a logical thing
To you,
to me anyway. So as I said, sleeping on my back. I do sleep on my back. I change to my side. I'll change to my other side. But while I do occasionally sleep on my stomach at home, it's not something that I ever do when I'm hiking. So as I said, it was a surprise to me. The next question we asked is, what is the main reason for your choice of sleeping mat? And certainly the big choice here was comfort, followed by weight and size when packed. R value was the third choice, how warm it keeps you. Then followed equally by durability and cost. Size and use was the next one. And then the brand. So the brand really was the last choice. People really did rate comfort and features over the brand of the mat more than anything else. The question we'd asked after that is, what type of sleeping mat do you use? And this, to some extent, didn't surprise me, although there was a one response which did. So 76% of hikers who camp overnight and responded to the survey used an inflatable sleeping mat. And this probably matches in what I've seen people using when I've been out hiking. 19% were using a self-inflating mat. This tends to be an older style mat. And as I said, I've gone from a stage of using a foam mat to using a self-inflating mat to using an inflating mat. And I think a lot of people who use self-inflating mats possibly are people who've had them for a while, because they will last quite a while, and just haven't bothered to upgrade to an inflatable mat.
but if it works, hey?
It does. And one of the disadvantages with inflatable sleeping mats is you've got to look after them a bit more. If you put them onto sharp rocks, really you potentially have the risk of putting a hole in them. I haven't had that issue. I've had my current mat for 3 years and haven't put a hole in it.
Yeah, I have. and patched it badly, but hey, hasn't quite worked. But
5% of people used a dedicated foam mat, and that was, I expected this to be the lowest one, but it did surprise me that it was as low as it was. That only 5.5% of people were using a foam mat. I would have thought more people would have been using this. But as I said, when I think about this, when I see people sleeping out on the trail, I don't really see that many people using foam mats. It's not that common. The last question we asked people is the brand of sleeping mat. What were they using? And the big one was Thermarest at 32%. Now, given that Thermarest for many years owned this segment of the market, it's not unsurprising. Cedar Summit, which is an Australian company who sells worldwide, just over 29%. Funnily enough, the next next brand that fit in here was Other, then followed by Exped at 10%, Climate at 6.5%, Nemo at 4.5%, and Big Agnes at around about 2.5%. So these were the main models that you'll find on the Australian market, with, in this case here, with basically 60% being taken up by the two large brands that are pretty much sold worldwide. Now, as we said, brand probably isn't important. It's more the features and the function is what people tend to look at. So then we looked at just recently some of the newest sleeping mats that have come onto the market. And we've just, in releasing this podcast, we went through and tested out a series of these mats. Now, I won't specifically discuss brands here, but if you go through and have a look at the written version, we'll keep the up-to-date models that have been released onto the market, and they'll have the links to the full reviews as well.
And we'll be releasing those over the next week or so. And we'll also, after that, we'll be releasing some video reviews of some of the sleeping mats as well for those who are into video reviews. But as long as you're not too critical about our expertise on being videoed and talking and doing at the same time. It was an entertaining experience.
But suffice to say that really the technology on mats is changing quite dramatically. And I suppose from my perspective, if someone were to ask me what my perfect sleeping mat is, my response would be it costs very little, it weighs almost nothing, it has an R value of 3.8 or greater, it's really durable and really comfortable and packs down to about the size of a tennis ball. And I think most people would agree that that would be a really good, perfect sleeping mat.
Yes, perfect.
However, that mat doesn't exist at the moment, at least not on the retail market. But given that where sleeping mats have come from in the last 10 to 20 years, it wouldn't surprise me that in another 10 to 20 years that this perfect mat exists. There are certainly good materials that are very durable, that are very minimal in weight, but getting all of these things in one package is a really difficult thing to do. Given that the perfect sleeping mat doesn't exist at the moment, when it goes through to choosing a sleeping mat, it really does come down to individual need. There is no one right answer, and everyone will have a particular choice, whether it be by brand or features that they'll want to go through. So in relation to features, there are two key ones which I'd probably recommend if you're looking at getting a new sleeping mat or your first sleeping mat. The first one is comfort. And again, what is comfortable is going to depend on your own individual definition. For me as a side sleeper, I need lots of cushioning underneath my hips when I roll over. And Jill will attest to this. I don't roll over, I flip.
Like a pancake.
So,
I roll over. I'm a side sleeper at times too, and I will just gently wander over to my side, but Tim will just flip and bounce everybody in all directions.
So having a good mat with lots of comfort really is going to make a big difference. The second criteria, as I said, is warmth. I don't typically camp in snow conditions. I do occasionally, but it's really rare. But in most cases, I'm camping through wintertime. I'm camping in temperatures that are below zero when there's frost, quite often heavy frosts. So having a sleeping mat that's going to do me year round is what I tend to look at.
Yeah, and I find that even in warm conditions, I can feel the coolness coming up underneath me. Probably partly why I don't sleep on my back too much. I just try to expose as little as I can to the ground by sleeping on my side.
So from a personal perspective, some people tend to be cold sleepers, some people are warm sleepers. So if you know you're a cold sleeper, you know you're going to be camping through most of the year in very cold conditions, and you only want to have one mat, that's what you need to go through and buy, that mat that's going to last you the entire year. If you don't mind having two mats, you might have a really ultralight mat. And as this podcast goes to air, the lightest mat on the market is around about 250 grams. Not really going to suit you for the middle of winter when in freezing cold conditions, but certainly a wonderful summer mat. But in that case, you might have a really lightweight, low R value mat for summertime, and you'll have a heavier weight, more insulating mat with a higher R value for wintertime. So it is going to depend on whether you want to get away with one mat or two mats that are going to last you throughout the year. From there, the other criteria that are going to come into this is things like the length and width of the mat. Now, I'm roughly about 185 centimetres tall, and I tend to buy a sleeping mat that's around about my height. There are shorter mats. There are longer mats on the market, and a lot of the mainstream brands will produce small versions or regular versions and long versions. Some of them will even produce a half-size versions that you can just sleep your torso on.
Except when you're talking about women's mats, and then they have regular and large.
Yeah.
I don't know why. Not long, but large.
And typically women's mats will, the reason they're sold as women's mats is they will often tend to be shorter. They tend to be wider at the waist, and they often will have, the waist and the hips, and they'll often tend to have a bigger insulation as well. But just because a mat is labelled as a women's mat, it doesn't mean that guys can't use them. If you happen to be a slightly shorter guy,
I think if you just want a bit more generosity around the middle, women's mats are a good option for you.
Yeah. So I mean, just because a mat is labelled male, a man, or a unisex mat or a female sleeping mat, don't rule it out just because it's being sold as a women's mat. So the other criteria, apart from the size and dimensions, is the cost. Really, probably one of the dearest mats on the market at the moment is around about the $400 mark. The cheaper mats, if you're looking at the foam mats, are under $100. But again, it comes down to a comfort level that, your level of comfort's going to come in there. Colour is going to be another thing you might want to choose. And then the weight of the mat itself. You'll find usually that the heavier a mat is, the cheaper it tends to be as well, but not always the case. That's often a bit of a generalization. So as we said, really what it comes down to is it needs to suit your style of hiking, your budget and your features that you desire. But otherwise, go through and lay on them is probably the best thing I can recommend. If you've used a friend's mat in the past and you know what it feels like, laying on them is probably the best way to try them out, just to see what they're like. We hope this has been a bit of a basic introduction to sleeping mats for you. There is a written version of this podcast which will have images of everything we've discussed, and also provide links to the new standard for R-value for sleeping mats. And also take you through to reviews of sleeping mats that we've gone through and reviewed, particularly the more modern ones just recently. Our next segment is our iTunes reviews, or possibly we should be saying our Apple Podcast reviews. We haven't actually read these out for a while, so here's some of the more recent ones just to give you an idea about what people are saying about Australian Hiker. The first one from Nicoletta Neva is very measured, calm podcast. I really appreciate the valuable, well thought out information the hosts give. Thanks. The second from Seb News, Feeding the Urge. Great to have a podcast with quality Australian content. Gear reviews are excellent, and the Savage duo cover a great range of topics, all relating to Australian hiking. Perfect podcast to feed the urge to get outdoors.
And the next review is from Rock H Core. Informative. This is a great podcast with lots of different topics relating to hiking. Have learned a lot and is highly enjoyable. And Jeff Can 1, new listener, new to you and loving the podcast and website. Great mix of info and interviews.
Okay, so thanks for those great reviews. Much appreciated. And remember, if you want to hear your review written out on the Australian Hiker podcast, just go through onto Apple Podcasts and give us a 5-star review.
We greatly appreciate the feedback, and it drives us to doing more and doing better. So thank you.
All right, that's all for this week's episode. We hope you've enjoyed. Our next episode is in 2 weeks' time. We originally had planned to release around about 38 episodes a year. This year is a bit of a big year for us. We've got about 48 episodes going to air, so it's almost weekly, but not quite. So our next regular podcast episode in 2 weeks' time is titled Zen and the Art of Hiking. And we're going to be looking about why people hike and what they actually get out of hiking. This is a bit more of a cerebral podcast, I suppose.
Okay.
Okay, that's all for me. Bye for now.
And bye from me.